Hello, and welcome to my Vray for Rhino tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about daylighting, and we're going to attempt to take a simple interior living space like here and render it to have this nice, warm, daylit glow. And we want to do this without adding any artificial lighting whatsoever. So we'll be taking a model like this, and in the end, we'd like to create something like this. So what you can see here is a well-lit space, lots of glazing here, light kind of pouring in, but there's no artificial lighting. We don't have any cans modeled or any floor lamps or anything like that. We're just want to create, or we want to understand our space from a pure daylighting perspective. And so today we're going to work through the steps from scratch that we can do to get there. So I have my model here. It's just a pretty straightforward living space, some really big floor-to-ceiling windows, not much going on here. And in Vray, I'll open up the asset editor, and we'll see that I have set everything to the default settings so that we can sort of build this from scratch. If you haven't seen my other global settings tutorials where I kind of run through how to set this up for working with an HDRI and a sun lighting sources, be sure to check those out. But if you haven't, it's fine. We'll kind of do that from scratch here as well. So the first thing I want to do when I'm setting this up is I'm going to make a few new materials, and these materials are you can see this file has a bunch of stuff for various other tutorials I've made. I'm going to make a few new materials that we're going to use to override everything that's in here. So I'll go to create a new material, a generic material. And I'm going to call this light gray override. Light gray override. And all this material is going to be simply just a light gray. So I'll change the diffuse color to a nice light gray. Not quite white, but almost there. I'm going to make another color. And I'm going to call it medium gray override. And that will be the same thing, just like a sort of nice medium gray. Somewhere in there. And I'll explain what those are going to be for a minute. What I want to do here, if I go to my main settings tab, if I go down to material override and drop down here, I'm going to turn this on. So what this is going to do is essentially override all of the materials that are already set up. So I have various like wood flooring and brick and ceiling textures and a lot of stuff on the exterior. And rather than go through every layer one by one and put them all on this nice light gray that we're going to do, I'm just going to override everything all at once. So my override color, I'll select my light gray override. So what this has done is everything in this image is going to be rendered as a light gray. And so, if we remember back from the final, the goal of this is just to really understand the daylighting effects on the space and have everything be this sort of soft, warm, white glow. Once we've achieved this effect, it's easy enough to go in and just start adding in real materials to your floor, your ceiling, your kitchen, and whatnot to kind of go from there. But the goal of this is to really focus on the lighting aspect of it. So we'll take the color out of the equation by just making everything light gray. A few things that I don't want to be overwritten though. So if I go to my materials and I go to my glass, this is just a standard glass that was imported from the defaults here that I'm using. I want to be able to see through my windows. Right now, this is going to override them so that they're also just an opaque light gray. So if I go to my material options, can be overridden, I'm going to actually, that is typically checked. I'm going to uncheck it so that it cannot be overridden. I'm also going to go to that other medium gray override, and I'm going to uncheck that as well. I'll explain why in a second. So outside of this model, there's some pretty dumb simple context. I'm going to put that context on that medium gray layer. And the reason I'm putting it on a sort of like medium gray and not the light gray is just because it's going to be outside, it's going to be getting hit with the direct sun, and I don't want it to get too blown out. So I set it to a medium gray, so it'll read as basically the same light gray as everything else. Medium gray, right. I'll do that for the sidewalk as well. All right, so I have all my context on the medium gray. Everything else is on a light gray except for my glass, which is on the glass layer. Great, so that's set up. Now what I want to do is start thinking about my light sources. So as we said, we're only going to be doing daylighting. So the most important light source is going to be our sun. So if I go to my sun tab here, if you don't have this tab, you can just right click anywhere and go to the drop down for sun. And in my sun tab, first thing I do is turn my sun on. And now I'm just going to use the manual control to control exactly where my sun will be coming in. And when I do this, I like to look at my project in plan as a way to understand. So when this is in plan and I'm looking at my subposition in plan, I know that these are going to be the same. So for example, this is set to, my sun's going to be coming from the southeast at a 135-degree azimuth. So I can, of course, turn manual control off, and I could set to an exact city, and I could do an exact time if I wanted to really understand the true effects of daylighting at certain hours. But for this, I really just want to simplify it, and just, I know that I want my sun kind of coming in at the southwest, and I know I'm going to take the sun angle a little bit lower to kind of pull that sun in as far as possible. So, you know, we'll just sort of like a winter morning sun, we'll say. All right, so we'll have those set up. If I go to my asset editor and look at my lights, you can see that that sun is right there as well. We'll come back to adjusting those settings here in a minute. The other light source I want to add is an HDRI, and while this won't be creating actual shadows, it'll be giving the sort of atmospheric effects of like the warmish glow, and it'll also give me a background. If you go to the final thing, you can see that sort of sky and trees in the background. This is going to be the dome that encompasses the entire project and acts as a secondary light source. So this will make more sense as I work through it. So to add that, we go to our Vray tools, and under our light tools, under the drop down, we're going to use the dome light tool. So if I click there, it's going to ask me to choose a location. I can just click anywhere, it doesn't matter where you put it. And as soon as I click it, it immediately prompts me to choose the dome texture. So what I'm going to do is use an HDRI. So there are lots of free HDRIs online, so just a quick Google search and you could probably find a few to use as an example. I have some here that I got on like a free giveaway or something for a website. I'm going to use this 105. I think it will work well for this. So now, while I can't see anything, I know that essentially there's been an entire dome placed over the whole of my project, and that dome is mapped with this texture of the sky. And so that I know where it is, this arrow points to the center of the HDRI image. And in this particular HDRI image, which I can bring up because I think it'll be worth looking at what that looks like. So we chose that 05, so we can see what that looks like. This is what's going to be mapped all around. So it's a pretty generic ground. There's some trees in the back, and just a sort of middle of the day sky with some clouds. And it looks very warped because you have to imagine this is warped around an entire sphere around your project. But it's super high res, and as an HDRI, it's not just a giant JPEG. What it is it actually has lighting information embedded within the file that will affect the scene, especially as far in terms of atmosphere, to get some tones and colors in there. But it also has a bright spot, which is the sun, and it's in the center of the image. So if I look here at this arrow, this is pointing to the center of the image. So you just kind of have to remember that that is sort of pointing to the middle. So if I want to rotate this dome around in space, I can just rotate this arrow. And so essentially, I want to rotate this arrow to be pointing at where the sun in Rhino is. So I have this sun in Rhino that is coming from the southeast and going down, and then I have my dome atmospheric light that is, I'm pointing to the southeast because that's where the center of the image is. So both my dome and my Rhino sun are now synced together. And that's just to make sure that there aren't any funny lighting things that don't make sense, where the shadow is going one way, but you see the sun coming from the other direction, and your eye will immediately catch that that feels weird and doesn't quite make sense. So it's always good to get those synced up. That said, they don't have to be absolutely perfect. They just have to be generally coming from the same direction. So now that we have our two lighting sources set up, let's go into Vray and go back to our interior view. I'm just going to do a quick render just so we can see where we are. Again, I've changed none of the Vray settings. This is sort of just out of the box Vray. We'll see where we're at, and then we'll make all the adjustments to get to where we want to be. So I'm just going to click well, before I do that, I will change the quality just so that this renders faster. I'm going to turn that down to low, and I'm going to change my aspect ratio to match my viewport, so I'm actually rendering what I'm seeing here. And I'll bump up the image quality, or the size, to 2000 pixels. It automatically updates the height to 1064, which is just matching my dimensions of my screen. But I haven't changed anything else. I'm simply just setting it up so that it's will render a quick thing, and it'll render the right actual image. So I'll hit play, and we'll see what's working and what's not, and then we will adjust it from there. So as we can see, the image it's still processing, and this will take a good while. It's rather slow with these settings that are on here, and using these render engines. We're going to adjust those to use the irradiance map and the brute force rather than the light cache, because one, of the time that we're going to spend, but also just to get a little bit more crisp, clean look. But I think the thing to note here is how, without even letting this entirely finish, you can see how washed out we are here at the windows, and we have all these hot spots, and it's there's sort of a lot of issues to work through. It's sort of overly warm as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that and start to work through some of the changes we can do to get that better. So if I kind of start here at the top, the first thing I'm going to want to do is go to my global illumination, and I'm going to change the primary rays to irradiance map and the secondary rays to brute force. So this is just going to be using different render engines. I'm also going to turn off the progressive rendering because I want to use the bucket rendering mode and not the VBF mode. So this will be, I think, will render something like this much faster. So once I have changed my rendering engines, I'm going to go ahead and see how that looks. So I'll hit render again, and we can see the difference. All right, so what we can see here is one, that render is significantly faster, but there's a lot of new problems, right? So one, the sun is just way, way too intense, right? It's coming in here really, really harsh, and it doesn't feel like a natural warm glow that you might expect for a daylit scene. And two, and this is a very common problem, everything is very blotchy. I see this all the time. And students asking me, how can I fix this blotchiness? And we also, it's pretty contrasty, right? We have like some pretty dark spots and some really, really hot spots. So we're not getting a good balance of light in here. So let's adjust a few things to deal with these issues. So the first thing I want to do is start to think about how I can control the lighting of the scene and the lights themselves to kind of balance each other out. So what I'm going to do first is turn my exposure down, which will actually make it brighter counterintuitively. So I turn this down to 8, which will brighten up the image. But I'm also going to turn my lights way down. So the sun, I'm going to change the intensity to 0.1, so that's significantly 10 times smaller. And I'm also going to but I'm going to make my dome light brighter. So I'm going to turn that up a little bit so that I can make sure that it's providing as much sort of atmospheric lighting as possible. But I want to turn the sun down because it's just way too intense and it's kind of like blasting all of the light gray surfaces. But so with turning the lights down, but I've also turned the exposure up by changing this from 10 to 8. That'll help let in more light so that it should read a little bit more evenly. So let's take a look at what that gets for us. All right, so we can see we're getting a lot more of a balanced, even lighting on this. Nothing is, we're not getting nearly as blown out here at the windows, and the contrast is a lot more evenly dispersed. But we still have this blotchiness, right? So and we also, if I look here at these shadows, they're all very, very fine and crisp, and I kind of want to get that nice sort of diffuse, blurry shadow that would come in and hit the floor and sort of blur away as you get farther from the object. So let's first go to our sun, and the way we're going to control those shadows to get a nice, more of a soft glow is the size multiplier. So I'm going to bump that up to 6, which will give a nice sort of fuzzy shadow. And leave that at 2. Let's go back to my settings. I'm going to turn my ambient occlusion on, and I also want to fix the blotchiness. So if we look at these results, this blotchiness is kind of really a mess here. So I'm going to actually just render one little section to show you how we get rid of that. So back to my settings. So the way we're going to control that is going to be through our subdivisions and our interpolation. So these are going to control the amount of blending and interpolation of the nearest kind of neighbor light sources and the amount we subdivide for direct computation. So if I kick this up, and we can see that if I hover over this, 1 is the minimum and 1,000 is the max, and we're down at 40, which is really low. I'm going to bump this up to 200, and I'm going to bump up the interpolation to 100. If this gets up too, if the interpolation goes up too high, it starts to make things a little fuzzy and like sort of blends the lighting quality a little bit too much. So I like to keep the interpolation at half of what I keep my subdivisions. You can see that changed my quality to custom because I'm sort of, the quality is tied in with the subdivisions and the min and max rate. So I'm going to keep my low quality, which will have a little bit of a fuzziness now for this test render. We'll kick that up for the final. But the fuzziness will be controlled by the min and max rate, but the smoothness, we'll call it, will be controlled by the subdivisions and interpolation. So again, I'll kick that up to 200, put that to 100. The other thing I want to change here is for my render elements, I want to add my material ID output. This will be important later as we blend two different images together. And I think that should be good to go. So let's render that little section of the ceiling to make sure the fuzziness is going away, and then I think this will be ready to go for a high-res rendering. And so without changing the overall quality, but just changing the subdivisions, we can see that this spot is rendering much, much smoother compared to, you can see that where, you know, what was redone and what was not is much, much smoother. And it doesn't slow the rendering time all that much. What's going to slow the rendering time is going to be setting the min and max rate. Changing the subdivision slows it somewhat, but not a whole lot. So this is pretty close to what we want. I'd say it's a little bit dark, but we're going to come in and do our little final tweaks with the exposure setting on the final here, so that we can get the exact outputs we would like to get to our final product. So let's go in and set this up for a high res rendering. So if I come to my settings, I'm going to put this to high, so my min rate is -3, my max rate is -1. My subdivisions I'm going to bump up way to 300, and my interpolation I'll put at half of that at 150. Everything else seems to be ready to go. We added that material ID render element. We're not going to worry about the depth of field or any other effects right now. I'm going to kick this up to, we'll say 3,000 pixels wide, just a little bit bigger if I was going to do this for a final rendering. I might even kick that up higher to like say like 5,000. I typically don't go much higher than that unless I'm printing at full scale, but if it's just going to be a digital presentation, 3,000 to 5,000 is usually pretty good. We have our override set. I'm turning on swarm to use all of my render firepower. We can cover that in a different tutorial. Our lighting is good to go. So, and let's just go ahead and hit render and we'll hit play and let that render. Alright, so here we have the final result. We can see all the walls look nice and clean and smooth. We have our light coming in. We can see the sort of glow around the windows. It's generally a little darker than what I would like, but from here because we are focusing on only being lit by the exterior lighting, and we have no artificial lighting. This will get us where we want to be because we can do some final little tweaks at the end here. So what I'm going to do is go to my show corrections control down here in the bottom left. And this sets up some sort of within Vray just color corrections, something that you might be familiar with in Photoshop. So the first thing I'm going to play with is exposure. So I'll put these back to sort of like the defaults. So you can see once I turn this on, I'm going to play with the exposure to get the room to the right level I want. So I basically rendered this sort of in between being the right amount of brightness for the outside and the inside, knowing that I can increase the exposure, which you can sort of think about as letting in more light to be corrected for the interior, and then I will adjust the exposure for the exterior, and then the goal is to bring those two together in Photoshop so that we have a perfectly balanced image. So for the interior, I'm going to brighten this up a little bit. I'm going to turn the highlight burn all the way down to kind of help with those hot spots, which I can turn this up. So we can get this up to about, you know, maybe there feels kind of nice. So the windows look a little bit washed out, but nothing is a true hotspot. It still feels like a nice, soft balance of white material. Nothing is totally blown out. So once I have where the brightness that's feeling like the glow I want on the inside, I will save that. And I'm going to use the double save icon to make sure that it saves not only this image, but it saves the material ID layer, which will be helpful for blending those windows back in later. So I'll save this file. Here, I've already saved it, so I'm not going to save it again. And now what I'll do is I'll adjust the exposure so that it is correct for the glass itself. So I'm going to bring that back down to somewhere there. Take this highlight burn back to about here. So I'm only focusing on the exterior glass now, what looks nice out there. So if I go too high, it gets washed out. If I go too dark, it doesn't feel like a bright day outside. So I'm going to go somewhere in here, and I'm going to save this image as well. And I'll go to that same folder, but I won't save it because I've already done it ahead of time. So without rendering twice, I'm just saving it twice by adjusting the exposure each time. Now what I'll do is I'll go into Photoshop, and I will open up the window version, the room version, and the material ID. I'll open up all three of those files. Alright, so I have the file we saved that has the correct exposure for the inside, the correct exposure for the glass, and the material ID. So first thing I'll do is just combine those all in one file. So material ID, I'll right click on my layer 1, duplicate layer, I'll put that in my file number 13 PMG, save, close that. I'll select this layer, right click, duplicate layer, change it to also image 13. Because I haven't because they're all done from the same view, they will all perfectly align right on top of each other. I don't need to scale anything. So now what I'm going to do is go to my material ID layer, which is made the windows yellow. I'm just going to do a simple magic wand tool. So that's here, fourth one down, or W is the shortcut. I'll just click in the middle, and then I'll right click And I can go to select similar, which selects all the yellow space. Can turn that off, and I will go to my layer 3, and now I'm going to select the inverse. So I'll go to select inverse. So I've selected everything but the lights, and I'll do Control X to cut it out. So essentially I've cut out everything but the windows. So I have these windows are on their own layer, and then I have the main real monotone layer. So now I'm just going to do some simple color corrections to get these together. So in my layer 1, I'll add an adjustment layer for brightness and contrast. And if by holding Alt, you can see when my cursor is on that layer, it makes this little down arrow. That will attribute this adjustment layer only to that specific layer. So I'm going to just play with that brightness just to get a sort of final tweak and get it exactly where we want it. Play with the contrast. I might actually turn that contrast down a little bit, sort of there. So I'm at 30 and minus 25. And then for my windows, I'll do the same thing. I'll add an adjustment layer for brightness and contrast. I'll hold Alt and attribute that only to my layer 3. And this is just a way to adjust the brightness and contrast of your layer, but also to have a record of it. So when you come back later and you look at the file, you don't know how much you adjusted it, you can just click on this and see how far you've adjusted it from the original. I find it very helpful to just know it's keeping every file as its original and showing my adjustments I make to them. So this, if I just start to brighten up that glass just a little bit there, trying to get to that perfect balance, maybe a little bit more contrast, where this is starting to feel like that nice warm daylit scene. You can see there's a little bit of fuzziness here from that click. If I just go and do a type M for selection, rectangular mask, you can just go to my layer 3 and just clip that off. Just sort of got a little fuzzy at that edge for whatever reason. Sometimes the material ID gets a little weird when it interacts at the corners of glass, but just trim that off. There we go. So now that I got the exterior to feel like I'm able to see through and understand the sort of nice sort of partially cloudy day, the interior feels like I'm seeing exactly how much lighting the exterior lighting is providing. Everything has this sort of nice warm glow, sort of perfectly daylit scene. And then in this image in particular, there's generally too much ceiling and sky. So just from a compositional standpoint, I would maybe do a crop, which gets me here to the final image that we looked at to start. Now we have a perfect little living room scene here that is 100% daylight, and we can understand the impacts of the glazing and what that means for daylighting this space. And it also is primed for potentially adding other materials and taking the scene forward, but we know that our lighting is set up. And of course we could always come in and add artificial lighting as well if we wanted to change it to a different time of the day where we're not getting as much sun in and it starts to get too dark. We could start to add some can lights in and work with that, but from a pure daylighting standpoint and understanding the daylighting goals of the design of this space, we can really understand what we've developed. So we will stop it right there. Thank you.